Sakalo, Kotu Mamu Yandinganda. Sikalende Venisi Drillis Canosinga. Kotu Mami Yam Siginimba. Mnu Yandi Chisalom Lilo. Oh Mama Jacha. Ay Jacha.
You may have heard about apartheid in South Africa. Separate entrances, separate beaches, even separate schools and benches. Legislation restricted where you could go, who you could marry, and where you would live. But how did the country come to be ruled by racist laws which enshrined white supremacy? And how did such a small minority of whites come to oppress the majority of black people? Apartheid officially began in 1948, but there were centuries of settler colonialism and occupation before that by two European powers which made it all possible. In 1652, Jan van Riebeck, an employee of the Dutch East India Company, landed at the southern tip of Africa. His mission was to set up a refreshment stop and supply company ships headed to Asia with fresh vegetables and meat. The Dutch grew the vegetables themselves, but began trading with the local people for meat, many of whom were Khoisan. But the relationship soured because the Dutch started grabbing land which did not belong to them, and encouraging Dutch farmers to move to the Cape. By 1657, the Dutch started allocating farms to European settlers in and around Cape Town. They became known as the Boers. As the refreshment station began to grow, the Dutch East India Company and the settlers needed more labor. So the Dutch captured people from East Africa, Dutch Batavia or the East Indies, Mauritius, Mozambique and Madagascar, enslaved them, transported them to the Cape, and often sold them again. The Cape became a slave society for the next 176 years, and more than 60,000 people were either brought or born as slaves in the Cape Colony. Many years later, most of the descendants of slaves would be classified as coloured by the apartheid government. Settlers from all over Europe began to move to the Cape, including Germans and French Huguenots, and encroached on the Khoisan. But then the British arrived in 1795, and finally in 1806, the colony was fully ceded to the British. The British then encouraged their own settlers to move to the Cape Colony, and more than 4,000 of them arrived in the 1820s. Many ended up settling in the eastern part of the country and in Natal. The Dutch farmers were really unhappy about British rule in the Cape, and it led to the Great Trek, a movement of Afrikaners or Boers to the interior of South Africa in search of a free and independent homeland away from the British. And it led to the establishment of the Free State and the Transvaal. Except the new homeland was already founded and inhabited land. And the trek led to more colonialism and bloodshed for local people. For the next 100 years, the Boer and the British fought frontier wars against the Xhosa people, the Zulu, Ndebele, the Bapedi, and the Basotho, who were dispossessed by them. European settlers used the empty or vacant land theory and claimed that South Africa was empty and the Bantu tribes or African natives moved there from what is now Zimbabwe at a similar time to colonists. This allowed them to justify stealing land from the original inhabitants. The theory has been debunked a bunch of times by researchers. By 1850, the British granted limited self-government to the Transvaal. But when diamonds and gold were discovered a few years later, it led to two Anglo-Boer wars. As part of a military campaign, the British even established concentration camps for Boers and Africans during the war. Some reports say nearly 30,000 Boer died. The British didn't bother keeping records of African deaths. At the same time, the British established Natal, a coastal colony. They fought and finally defeated the Zulus who lived there as part of an empire run by King Shaka. The British also brought indentured labourers from India to work on the sugarcane plantations in Natal. Traders from India also landed in Natal. These were the forebearers of South Africa's Indian population. Finally, in 1910, the Union of South Africa was formed. But if you weren't either Boer or British, you really didn't have a say in where the country was headed. The British colony was made up of Natal and the Cape, while the Boer colony was made up of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. But the Boer and British were faced with what they called the native question. What would they do with the original inhabitants of South Africa, whom they continued to dispossess? They enacted laws to legislate stealing land from Africans and consolidating white settlements, like the Land Act of 1913, which prevented black people from owning land outside certain areas. By 1934, South Africa became a sovereign independent state, and Britain was removed from legal authority. By 1948, the National Party, an Afrikaner nationalist party, took power of the country and introduced apartheid, an oppressive regime of domination by white people over the rest of the country.